So now let's shade our first complex object. Before we do, let's draw it. First, I think we should measure the proportions, side to side, against top to bottom, and draw a rectangle that is ever so slightly longer than the width. Something that looks maybe like this. Now I'm going to draw the contours very lightly and in a simple way. So don't go into dark lines right away. You can measure angles. It's going this way. We can measure an angle going this way, going like this. We have an angle going this way. And then once the object is sketched in, you can go over it with a darker line that is a little bit more detailed. So it curves in this way, goes like this, curves in this way, goes like this. Okay, there's our object. Now before we start shading, we need to indicate the shape of the light brick. The more complex the shape, the more complex the shape of the light brick. So on a sphere, we have a very simple shape in the light brick. It simply goes like this. We have a spherical object, but there's lots of bumps in it. So in this case, the light brick starts here, goes down this way, then goes up a little bit, it goes across this way, goes up a little bit, goes across this way, then runs down like this, and then runs underneath. And because we have a rounded bottom, it also runs along the bottom edge here. Again, the more complex the shape, the more complex the light brick. Sometimes the light brick is going to get lost. You have to know what to look for in order to actually see it. So we know that in a sphere, our light brick runs across the bottom like this. We also have a light break here. Okay, so again, make sure you're using a soft line to indicate the shape of the light break, and then also indicate the shape of the cast shadow. Again, do not put a sharp edge there, because our cast shadow needs to soften as it goes back in space. What else do we need? We also need to indicate the location of our highlight. Okay, let's start shading this thing. I'm using a 2B pencil because our camera tends to lighten things a little bit, and I'm afraid you guys aren't going to be able to see this drawing. You guys start off with your HB. Let's start by separating out our highlight from our light. And shade the entire object down. This is an important step in order for us to be able to see our shadows better. Again, value is relative. I don't know how dark the shadow needs to go until I compare it to the light. So if I start shading against the white, I'm going to be tricked into not making my shadows dark enough. So now that we have a little bit of value here, in fact I think I'm going to put a little bit more, I'm going to bounce directly into the shadow and start shading. So at this point probably you guys should switch to your 2B pencil. And mostly what I'm thinking about right now is shadow edge. This is a body shadow. It needs to have a soft transition. Let's start making the shadow a little bit darker. Again, if you start seeing line direction, break up your pattern. Make sure your pencils are sharpened properly, by the way. In fact, I recommend having a bunch of pencils just ready to go so you're not constantly running back and forth sharpening your pencils. And have a few 2Bs, 4Bs. It'll make your drawing process more efficient. Okay, I'm going to start going a little bit darker. This image has a lot of contrast in it, so we can quickly go really dark. Now that I have a little bit of the shadow, now I can start going back to the lights. So this is a really important principle. Bounce back and forth between your shadows and lights and work on both at the same time. So we have a highlight here. Now let's start indicating the fact that there's a lighter light here, the lightest light, and the fact that our apple is going a little bit darker this way, and that we have a halftone here. So here's the lightest light. the next brightest value after the highlight. Let's start going a little bit darker here. We're starting to establish a halftone here, that little fuzzy transition that's neither shadow nor light. And then we have a little halftone here as well. Not quite shadow, not quite light. A little halftone here. And maybe a little bit of a halftone going all the way around this way. You can see, now that I've established the halftone, our shadow feels a little bit too light. We need to start increasing the contrast. So this is a 2B pencil. Let's switch to my 4B. Here's my 4B pencil. Let's start going darker. Most importantly, I want to make sure that I retain the shape of my light break. So initially, I put in this kind of snake-like serpentine line. Don't lose it. Do not simplify the light break. This is really, really important because our contour indicates what's happening on the outside of the form. Our light break indicates what's happening on the inside of the form. If I simplify the light break, it's going to tell the viewer that the inside of the apple is perfectly smooth, which it is not. So let's start going a little bit darker. By the way, it also helps to start shading the cast shadow. Why? Because value is relative. You need to have the cast shadow there to be able to compare it to the reflected light, to some of the darker areas. Very difficult to shade in isolation, just one thing at a time. Okay, so let's start going back and getting darker. Again, be patient, work in layers. Right now I'm going to start moving into the core shadow. You're going to feel when you need to switch pencils. So basically, if the next layer doesn't produce a darker effect, perhaps it's time to move to your softer pencil. So this is a 4B. I'm going to work a little bit more on the 4B, just a little bit. Let's see how dark I can go. You can always sneak your fingers a little further up to increase the pressure of the stroke. But it looks like I need to probably switch to my darker pencils. Let's do that. You really never want to jump. You don't want to go from 2B to 6B. That's going to produce a really rough effect. Make sure you're going through all of your pencils, your range of pencils, as you're working your way down. Alright, let's switch to our 6B. This is a 6B pencil. And we should be able to get almost everything done with our 6B. Graphite's not a particularly dark material. It tends to be kind of gray, silver. Fairly difficult to get a full range of contrast using graphite. But we're going to try our best, and then in a little bit, either next week or the following week, we're going to switch to charcoal pencils, which is going to make it very, very easy to get really strong contrast. But graphite pencils are safer. I think they're easier to learn with than charcoal, which has a tendency to be hard to control. Okay, let's go a little bit darker in the cast shadow. Keep your pencil moving, shade a little bit everywhere, right? So don't focus on any one spot for too long. Let's keep going a little bit darker. And probably at some point you realize that now that I've made this shadow really, really dark, that maybe parts of the light need to go darker as well. So I'm going to work a little bit more on the shadow. And then probably I'll bounce back to my 2B pencil and start introducing perhaps a slightly darker halftone. Like this. There's a little bit of texture on the apple. This might be a good time to start putting it in. Right, all that stuff is halftone. Don't make it too dark. That's going to punch through the form. It's going to make the forms look like there's some kind of cutout shape in them. Now, I notice that the coarse shadow runs here, and because light break runs all the way across the bottom, there's a little bit of coarse shadow there too. Just a little bit. Really big mistake is to connect the value here to the value here. That's going to make this part look entirely flat. All right, so quite often here, because of the strong reflected light, there's going to be a very similar value between the reflected light and the halftone here. Don't make them the same. You're going to make the halftone a little bit lighter than the shadow area. Just by a little bit, and make sure that there's a clear indicator of the light break. Make sure you can see the coarse shadow. Sometimes you as the artist have to emphasize that kind of stuff for the sake of clarity. Right? The object has a texture to it, or a really complex shape. Quite often these things are very difficult to see. They can't be drawn the way you're actually seeing them. You have to emphasize the form ever so slightly. Okay, so looking at it now, I think maybe, just maybe, the highlight could be a little bit poppier, a little bit stronger, a little bit brighter. I'm going to make the coarse shadow really, really dark. Really dark. However, I notice that this part needs to go a lot darker. So one thing to keep in mind is that usually in any object there's going to be one part which is really dark, particularly where the object is touching the stand, the floor. And then everything else is going to be a little bit lighter. If I make the coarse shadow as dark as this occlusion where the forms are touching, it's going to create a tunnel. It's going to create a hole. So be careful. Focus on where the object is going really, really dark at its darkest, and make sure that everything else doesn't go quite that dark. Just building a little bit of contrast. I think sometimes it helps at the end to switch back to your 2B pencil for nuance, right? To get little subtle effects. So if you have an AP pencil, this might be the time to use it. Be careful though, because some brands of AP pencil go really, really dark. They almost become like a charcoal pencil. So be careful with your brand. Staedtler has some lines of their pencils which are sort of in between charcoal and graphite, and their 8B pencil is really hard, not really hard, really, really dark, and it's going to look like you've punched a hole through your drawing, basically. Okay, so that concludes this demo, I believe. In the next demo we're going to deal with an object with a slightly rougher texture.